Well, good morning, everyone. So glad to see you on this day. For those of you who are visiting with us, we are currently in the study of the book of Genesis, an expositional study. We're in chapter 9, and today we're going to be looking at one of the most problematic passages that we find not only in the book of Genesis, but throughout the entirety of the Bible. Today is part 2 of a two-part lesson. It might end up being part 3, depending on how much we are able to get through today. And I did want to allow a little bit of time for questions at the end, so we'll see how far we get. One of the things that we need to keep in mind as we prepare for our study today is that context is key. Context is always key. There was a young man who was before an ordination committee. This is what young men do if they want to be pastors. They have to sit before an ordination committee and answer various questions. And he went through okay, through most of it. At the very end, there was an older gentleman on the ordination committee that said, "I want for you to explain to me the parable of the Good Samaritan." Well, he said, once there was a man traveling on the road to Jericho from Jerusalem, and he fell among the thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked him. And as he went on, he didn't have any money, and so he met the Queen of Sheba, and she gave him 1,000 talents of gold. And he got into a chariot and drove quickly, and he passed by a big juniper tree, and his hair got caught on a limb in that tree, and he hung there for many days. The ravens brought him food to eat and water to drink, and it said that he ate 5,000 loaves and 2 fishes. One night, while he was hanging there asleep, his wife Delilah came along and cut off his hair, and he dropped, and he fell on stony ground. But he got up and went on, and it began to rain, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And he hid himself in a cave, and he lived on locust and wild honey. After the rain, he finally made it down to Jericho. And when he got there, he looked up and saw old Queen Jezebel sitting high in a window. And she laughed at him, and so he told the men standing behind her, "Throw her down." And they threw her down. And then he said, "Throw her down again." And they said, "How many times should we throw her down?" And he said, 70 times 7. And after they had done so, they picked up the fragments that remained of Queen Jezebel, and they picked up 12 basketfuls, saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," P-I-E-C-E. "Now," he said, "in the day of judgment, whose wife will she be?" Context is key. All of what I just told you is biblical. The problem is that it's taken out of the context in which these various statements are written. And while it's somewhat comical for us, there are many times that we see, and one in particular that it bears on our country's history, where because an entire ethnic group was enslaved. And we'll look at that, how that came to be here in just a moment. But I wanted us to continue where we picked off last week. We looked at Noah's children last week, and then Noah's sin, that is his corruption. And so today I want us to look at Noah's curse, and we find that in chapter 9, verses 22 through 27, and then Noah's conclusion, and that's going to be in verses 28 and 29. So let's go back and look at Noah's sin. You'll recall that Noah and his family got off of the ark, and Noah became a farmer. He planted a vineyard. And one of the things that he did after he got the produce of the vineyard, the grapes, is that he made wine, and he became drunk. And Moses, who writes the book of Genesis, describes this in verse 20 and 21. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself inside of his tent. So that sets up for us what we're going to look at today, and that's specifically Ham's sin. Ham is one of Noah's sons. Apparently, while Noah was passed out and exposed, Ham, his middle child, saw his father's nakedness and then went out and told his two brothers. Look at how Moses records this. Ham, the father of Canaan. Now, why does he mention that? Because if you look at the table of nations, which we'll cover either next week or the week after, Ham had several children. Why specifically mention Canaan? Or why does Moses mention Canaan? I think the answer to that becomes apparent as we continue through the story. It says that he saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Now, this is the second time that we've come across this adding of Canaan in the story here in chapter 9. For example, in verse 18 we saw, now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, who was the oldest, Ham, who is the middle child, and Japheth, who is the third child. And then Moses adds parenthetically, and Ham was the father of Canaan. Noah's other sons, after this sin occurred, and then Ham came out and told them, what they did is they grabbed a blanket, they walked backwards into the tent so that they would not look at their father's nakedness, and they covered his body. Moses writes in verse 23, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it upon their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Now, one of the questions, particularly as a 21st century person, that we would say as we look at this story is, what's the big deal? I mean, those of you who live in the South, you know, if you've gone to deer camp and those kinds of things, you've gone with your father, you've probably seen him doing all kinds of uncompromising things. But in terms of tradition in a patriarchal society, looking at one's nakedness in terms of the father was a great sign of disrespect. Dr. Alan Ross, who was a professor at Dallas Seminary, writes this in his commentary. He says, to the ancients, seeing one's father naked was a breach of a family ethic. The sanctity of the family was destroyed and the strength of the father was made a mockery. Ham apparently stumbled onto this accidentally, but went out and told his brothers as if he had triumphed over his father. Now, apparently Noah came to discern this. We're not told in the text how he came to discern it, but that he did come to know what Ham had done. We see that in verses 24 through 27. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Now, those of you who are observant notice that there in the text it says that Ham was referenced as the youngest child, when I just told you that Ham was the middle child. What's the deal with that? Well, in Hebrew, when you look at the term younger or youngest, it can mean younger than, or it can also mean youngest. Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who is himself a Hebrew scholar, writes this in his Bible commentary, quote, the Hebrew word for youngest can simply mean younger. And that is probably the better translation because Ham was the middle son. And so now the million-dollar question is, what exactly did Ham do to Noah? There have been various theories offered throughout church history. One commentator who writes a great article on this said this. He said, the elusive narrative of Genesis 9:20 through 27 has been exegetical puzzle since antiquity. The terseness of the account with its inexplicable features and subtle hints of sexual transgression has left generations of readers and scholars feeling that there's more to the story than the narrator has made out explicitly. As many have pointed out, interpretive debates generally revolve around two interrelated questions. One, what is the nature of Ham's offense? Why would Ham seeing Noah's nakedness merit a curse? And then two, what is the rationale for Canaan's punishment if Ham was the perpetrator? Why is Canaan being cursed? And that's a very perplexing question to answer because, after all, God makes it clear that each person pays for their own sin. Why is it that now we see Canaan being cursed when he didn't do anything? Well, there's 4 views to answer this question, and I want us to look at those. Some of these are not very good in terms of their exegetical support, so we won't spend too much time on them, but you do need to understand what they are. The first is what we might call the injury view. And in this view, what many people have said is that, well, Ham went into Noah's tent and he castrated his father, Noah, so that he couldn't have any more children, and that Ham would become the family patriarch by usurping the authority of his father. In terms of the merits of the case for this kind of thing, it's all tradition. There's nothing biblical that states specifically that Ham did this act to Noah. As a matter of fact, the first recorded, in terms of writing, evidence that we have is actually found in the 1500s when Theophilus of Antioch wrote an article, and this is what he said. And this is, again, the only evidence that we have for this particular view. And this, Noah had 3 sons whose names were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and these had 3 wives, 1 wife each man and his wife. This man, presumably Noah, some have surnamed Eunuchus, which means eunuch. All 8 persons, therefore, who were found in the ark were preserved. But that still doesn't really answer the question in terms of the curse. Well, it does if you realize that Noah lived to be an old man. He had 3 sons, but if, and just for the sake of argument, if Ham did castrate his father, that would have prevented him from having any more children, meaning that would prevented him from having a 4th son. That's why the tradition would hold that he cursed Canaan, because Canaan was Ham's 4th son. Dr. Fruchtenbaum again notes the rabbis claimed that what Ham did here was to castrate his father so that he could not have a 4th son. And since Noah could not have a 4th son, he cursed Ham's 4th son, who was Canaan. But again, there is no biblical validity for this view. So it's all based upon tradition, and mostly rabbinic tradition. So the strength of the view would be this. It explains in the story, in Genesis 9, why Ham's 4th son is cursed. Since Noah could not have another son, which would have been his 4th, thus he cursed Ham's 4th son. The weakness of this particular view is quite evident. It's not biblical. There's no biblical support for it. Nowhere in the biblical text does it ever state that Ham castrated his father. It is based simply on human tradition. So that's the first view. The second view is what we call the intrusion view. And in this view, it is said that Ham entered into Noah's tent, and he went outside and mocked Noah to his brothers to undermine Noah's dignity and authority. This, by the way, is the most common view held by Christians today. In other words, if you had to look at all of the views, this is the one that is most historic in terms of what is normally taught from pulpits and in classrooms. Dr. Scott Hahn notes, quote, "The strength of this position is its conservatism. It refuses to see anything in the text that is not explicit. It also requires the interpreter to assume the existence of a taboo against the accidental sight of a naked parent that is otherwise unattested in biblical or ancient Near Eastern literature." Meaning, people can say, well, to look upon one's parent is a sign of great disrespect, and in a patriarchal system, that was considered to be a taboo. But yet, Scripture nowhere tells us that that is the case. As a matter of fact, a lot of other traditions don't even tell us that is the case. That is something that is taken for granted and then read back into the text. You say, well, do people do that? Sure, they do that. Dr. John MacArthur, again, one of my theological mentors, said this: "There's no reasonable support for the notion that some perverse activity, in addition to seeing nakedness, occurred, but clearly the implication is that Ham looked with some sinful thought, if only for a while until he left to inform his brothers. Perhaps he was glad to see his father's dignity and authority reduced to such weakness. He thought his brothers might share his feelings, and so he eagerly told them. But when he told them, he realized that they didn't view things the way that he did, and they did the right thing by covering Ham. The problem with a particular aspect of this, what we might call the most traditional view, is that it also has problems that it doesn't address. For example, if Ham is the one who did this to Noah, why curse Canaan? Which is what Noah will do. There is nothing in the text that states Canaan did anything to assist Ham in this sin. This is the most significant problem with the view. That is, we have Noah, and then Noah has 3 sons, but in the context, we're dealing with Ham's issue, and then Ham will have 4 sons. And what's interesting is that Ham does not get cursed. I know a lot of people call this the curse of Ham. Ham does not get cursed. Only Canaan gets cursed. Ham's other children do not get cursed. But then that begs the question, why curse Canaan and why not curse Ham? Now, some have speculated that, well, whatever Noah saw in his son Ham, the same type of sinful inclinations that he observed in Canaan, that is Ham's 4th son. I had an old preacher friend of mine who's still kicking around in northeast Mississippi today. He taught me probably most everything I know on practical pastoral ministry. And he told me one time, he said, I'm going to share with you a maxim. A maxim is something that's generally true, but not universally always the case. He said, a father who takes his children to church, when those children get older, most often they will continue to go to church. If a father does not think highly regarding church and views church as more of a babysitting institution than he does in terms of spiritual nourishment, in terms of coming to worship God, and if God is not very important in the life of the father, then quite likely when the child gets to the age to where they will make their own decisions, they will abandon the church. And then he said, their grandchildren will not know God. Their grandchildren will not know God. And so it is assumed then that what God saw, or that is what Noah saw in the life of Ham, is something that he saw the inclinations of the seeds being developed in the life of Canaan as well. And that's why it is argued Canaan was cursed. Well, the problem with that particular view, and I would agree with that maxim that I just told you, but the problem with that particular view is that in trying to maintain a conservative view of the text, that is, by not reading anything into the text other than what the text says, then on what basis are you claiming, the question would be begged, that Canaan was somehow like Ham? So the strength of the view is that it is true to the explicit meaning of the biblical text in Genesis 9 without reading anything into the text. Secondly, it is the most common interpretation of the passage, but again, it does have weaknesses. The first being, it does not explain why Noah cursed Ham's 4th son Canaan instead of Ham. And some have stated that Canaan was somehow involved in Ham's sin, somehow that he assisted in that. But the problem is, that's not in the text. That is merely an assumption drawn based upon what we observe in terms of Noah's cursing Canaan. Also, it does not deal with Ham having done something to Noah. Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but those of you who used to live a life of debauchery before you became a believer, and I'm just speculating here, but there's probably been times on a Friday or Saturday night where you've had a little too much to drink. And if that was the case, imagine someone who's so liquored up that they pass out without any clothes on. Someone walks into the room, doesn't make a sound, Someone leaves the room, goes outside of the house and tells so-and-so, hey, you should see what so-and-so is doing in there. How would they even be aware of that? You see the problems that could creep in as we try to use logic and inference as we determine how Noah knew this. Well, I think there is a way to be able to address this particular issue in terms of Noah knowing what Ham did to him, which leads us into the third view, and that is the paternal incest view. In this view, Ham had sexually molested Noah while he was passed out to usurp his dignity and authority. Now notice what the text says in verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Dr. Hahn notes, as many others have pointed out, the way the text describes Noah as realizing what his youngest son had done to him suggests some action more substantial than a passive viewing. It suggests an act or a deed which Noah was the recipient or the victim. Well, is there any textual support that would give evidence to this being the case? Well, there is textual support for it. We have to go a little bit further down in biblical history during the time of Moses and the children of Israel. Remember, Moses writes the first 5 books of the Bible. He writes the book of Leviticus. He also writes the book of Genesis. Now, notice what Moses writes in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17. He said, if there is a man who takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, so that he sees her nakedness and she sees his nakedness, it is a disgrace. And they shall be cut off in the sight of the sons of their people. Why? He has uncovered his sister's nakedness. He bears his guilt. So what is Moses writing here? Well, he's using a figure of speech. He's using what is referred to as a Hebrew idiom. And an idiom is a figure of speech. We even have these in the English language. But an idiom has a meaning which differs from the normal meaning attached to the words that comprise the idiom. Let me give you an example. If I were to say, Billy kicked the bucket last week, then I would be telling you, in effect, Billy died. Billy passed away. But I would be using different words to describe what happened to Billy. And so the suggestion is that Moses is using an idiom to describe sexual intercourse. Leviticus 20:17 equates the idioms to see nakedness and to uncover nakedness as the same thing. Because the text says that Ham saw his father's nakedness. It doesn't say that he uncovered his father's nakedness, but that he saw his father's nakedness. So the theological tie then is not found in Genesis 9, but rather over in the book of Leviticus. So the phrase to uncover nakedness is the usual expression for sexual intercourse in the holiness code. Thus, from an intertextual perspective, the description of Ham's act as seeing his father's nakedness implies more than a literal seeing. For example, in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 19, it says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, which would be your aunt, or of your father's sister, which would be your aunt. For such a one has made naked his blood relative. They will bear their guilt. If there is a man who lies with his uncle's wife, which would be your aunt, he has what? Uncovered his uncle's nakedness. Not uncovered her nakedness. He uncovered his uncle's nakedness by uncovering his aunt's nakedness. They will bear their sin. They will die childless. So now we see what happens in Genesis 9 coming in a little more into focus, but there's still some issues with this view. Some of the strengths would be that it best explains what Ham possibly did to Noah, given the term to see nakedness described in Genesis 9. Secondly, the use of the Hebrew idiom is hermeneutically sound since Moses is the author of both Genesis and Leviticus. Now, we've covered this in other classes, so I won't labor it too much here, but if you are a diligent student of Bible study, there is certain procedures that you do whenever you study the Bible at all times. Contrary to popular belief, we don't study the Bible by looking at a verse and then going around the room saying, Jimmy, what does this verse mean to you? And, what does this verse mean to you? We don't do that because Jimmy could have an interpretation or application that would be totally different from the next person's, and which really begs the question. I'm not necessarily concerned about what Jimmy thinks. I'm not necessarily concerned about what the other person thinks. What I am concerned with is what does the author say, what he means by what he says, because that's the only interpretation. And so looking at the text then, we start with a target text, and then we would ask the question, do we see this seeing nakedness anywhere else in Genesis 9, in the paragraph? And what about the book? And then the author's writings. Now, obviously, as we're stepping back more and more, we know Moses wrote both books, and he does use the term to see nakedness and uncovered nakedness, which would give us a little more insight in how we could and probably should interpret what we see here in Genesis 9. The weakness of the view, again, is that there is nothing explicitly stated in the text that demonstrates that Ham had a homosexual relationship with his father. Also, it does not explain why Canaan is cursed instead of Ham, since he was the one who committed the sin. Just to let you guys know, some of y'all remember Dr. Harry Leaf, who was probably the greatest influence on my ministry and the way that I teach and so forth today, but he held this particular view. I was always wondering about that. That was the one question that always seemed very difficult. Well, wait a minute, I get it. If Ham did an egregious sin like this, I get that. But it never answers the question, why curse Canaan if he's not involved? Which leads us to the fourth view. It's also an incestuous view, but it's not a paternal incest view. It is the maternal incest view. In other words, it's not sexual relations or intercourse, homosexual, in the sense of Ham having relations with his father, but rather Ham having relations with his mother. Consider Genesis again, 9:18 and 19. Now the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then he adds, and Ham was the father of Canaan. Why would he write that like that? If he's trying to make a distinction. Yes, Noah's wife, it's possible, had another son, but Noah is not the father. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. Now when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him, so he said, watch this, cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants he shall be to his who? Brothers. He also said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. What's their relationship? And let Canaan be his servant. And may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. So how does Ham seeing the nakedness of his father equate to having an incestuous relationship with his mother? Because that's one piece of the puzzle that we've got to put together if this theory has any weight whatsoever. Dr. Hahn continues, in all of the Old Testament relevant text, the phrase seeing the nakedness of someone is associated with heterosexual activity. The nakedness of the father actually refers to the mother's nakedness. For example, in Leviticus 18, the nakedness of your father is defined as what? The nakedness of your mother. Now let's go back and look at Leviticus 18, 7 and 8. Again, God says to Moses and to the children of Israel by extension, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, that is, the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness." So to have sexual relations with his mother would be to what? To uncover the nakedness of his father. We don't just see that there. We also see that in Leviticus 18:14. "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother," which would be your uncle. "You shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt." So to have sexual relations with your aunt would be to what? Uncover the nakedness of your uncle. Leviticus 18:16. "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife," which would be your sister-in-law. "It is your brother's nakedness to uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife." Leviticus 20. "If there is a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is on them." Leviticus 20:11. "If there is a man who lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be surely put to death. Their blood guiltiness again is on them." There are also other Old Testament passages outside of what Moses writes to describe perhaps the motives for why Ham did what he did. It was a means of usurping the authority of the person whose spouse one is violating. For example, we all know the story of King David and how Saul pursued David and how eventually David became the king over Israel. And one of the things that it was instructed for David to do is to take Saul's wives and to take Saul's concubines. But David was selfish. He wanted more. You recall the sin with he and Bathsheba, where he eventually had her husband murdered. He carried his own death warrant back to the front lines, and the general sent him out there and then withdrew the troops so that he was killed by the enemy. Everything seemed to be going well until the prophet Nathan approached David to confront him with this sin. And he tells David a story. And what's interesting is that as a passive reader, you're looking at this, you can see exactly what David did as it is woven in this story that Nathan tells David. But just to show you how sin can cause us to be so self-deceived, he does not realize that he is the object of this story. And David is being rebuked by Nathan. And in 2 Samuel 12, Nathan said to David, "You are the man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel, and I saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more." So one of the things that David did as monarch to usurp the authority which God had given him over Saul was to take Saul's wives, to take Saul's concubines. We also see this done with Absalom when he does it to David. He chases David out of the city. He wants the throne. David flees. Absalom is standing there. He's already won the hearts of the people. And so he goes to David's advisor, Ahithophel. Say that 5 times. And he says to him, "What should I do?" And Ahithophel gives him this story. He said, "Go and sleep with your father's concubines, for he has left them here to look after the palace. Then all Israel will know that you have insulted your father beyond hope of reconciliation, and they will throw their support to you. And so they set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see it, and Absalom went in and had sex with his father's concubines. What did he say? Sounds like the will of God to me. Let's get this thing going. But the question then becomes, how does one explain that Noah woke up and then cursed Ham's fourth son, Canaan? Well, if he was the offspring of this incestuous relationship and he hadn't even been born yet, because when he wakes up, get this, because of the time period, now pay attention, from the moment of conception to the moment of birth is how long? 9 months. Which means Canaan did not exist yet while this was occurring, if in fact Noah woke up and then went out and cursed his fourth son. How do we explain that? Because that's commonly referred to as a problematic passage given this particular view. One possible answer is the way that Moses is writing this. This is not the only place he does this, mind you. The narrator, Moses, may have simply compressed the chronology at this point, as he does elsewhere. After all, in Genesis 5:32, for example, it says, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Did he have triplets? No. He's simply compressing in terms of time for the purposes of narrating the story that he had 3 sons born at 3 separate times, but he's compressing that because of the flow of the story. So Moses is simply compressing the details of the story. Now, what are the strengths of this particular view? Well, it best explains what Ham possibly did to Noah, given the term to see nakedness, which means to uncover nakedness, which means to, according to the holiness code in the book of Leviticus, if you uncover your father's nakedness, the implication is to have sex with his mother. Secondly, it explains why Noah curses Canaan and why his references to him as Shem and Japheth's brothers in the curse. When he says to Canaan will serve his brothers, and then the next reference to that is Shem and Japheth. The weakness of the view? Well, there's nothing explicitly stated in the narrative that Ham had relations with his mother. One has to look further in the Old Testament revelation to draw that conclusion based upon what Moses later writes. Now, the upside to that is there's good hermeneutical grounds to do that. That's normally the way that we do Bible study anyway. So what about the curse of Ham? Let's talk about that for a minute. The curse of Ham, as it has been called, has been used to justify the enslavement of millions of Africans. Dr. Paul Ham notes this in his article, The Curse of Ham. He says, the moral obscenity of slavery was the root cause of the American Civil War. Both sides enrolled God's authority in their cause. In the South, this was involved a literal reading of the Curse of Ham. Sulfuric Southern preachers thundered that Noah's condemnation of Canaan had condemned all Africans to slavery. And it was a rampant thought all through the southern part of the United States. As a matter of fact, one black clergyman notes this in his article, The Negro Race Not Under a Curse, writes, quote, the opinion that sufferings and the slavery of the Negro race are consequence of the curse of Noah is the general, almost universal opinion of the Christian world. So strong and tenacious is the hold which it has taken upon the minds of Christendom that it seems almost impossible to uproot it. Indeed, it is almost a foregone conclusion that the Negro race is an accursed race weighed down, even to the present, beneath the burden of an ancestral malediction or curse. What he's saying is simply this: everybody just came to accept it. That millions and millions of Africans could be enslaved because, after all, it was biblical. They were to serve their brothers. But what is the problem with the curse of Ham view to justify slavery? 3 answers, and they're very brief. First, Ham was not cursed. Only Canaan was cursed. There is no curse in Ham. Only Canaan was cursed. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan. Servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." But Ham is not cursed. Secondly, Canaan, if we take into consideration the very next chapter, the table of nations, and then how that will play out throughout Israel's history, Canaan and his descendants settled on the continent of Asia. Ham's other descendants settled on the continent of Africa. Having more melanin in one's skin color is biblically irrelevant. Not only did slave proponents not understand the Bible, apparently they did not understand geography. Why? Because they took slaves from the wrong continent. If you want to be biblical, then you have to go back and say, who were the descendants of Canaan? Where did the Canaanites reside? In and around Israel, what would become known as Israel. Here on the map. And then third and finally, and probably one of the most problematic passages for proponents of slavery would have been this: that kidnapping, or as it's referred to in some of your Bibles, man-stealing, for the purposes of enslavement, is a crime punishable by death. Exodus 21, verse 16, Moses writes this: "Kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves." There is no way to justify slavery, or what was slavery in this country. There's no biblical grounds to do it. And then the text moves us right back over to Noah's conclusion, Noah's death. After living a long life, Noah died a faithful servant, having been used mightily to preserve all of mankind. Verse 28. Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So what does Noah's life teach us about God today? That God knows how to preserve his people in the face of any and all adversity. God knows how to preserve his people in any and all adversity. That's not my words. Peter writes this over in 2 Peter 2 when he says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to the pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." In other words, Peter says, if he can do all of that, and he has, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. Noah's life teaches us that we can trust God no matter what.